it's Julia. Thank you so much for joining me today. I have a big craft show at the end of the month, a big arts and craft fair that I do every year, and I have been working on sweatshirts, getting ready, getting prepared for this big show. And I thought I would show you one of the ideas that I am doing on some of my sweatshirts this year. I did this a few years back, and I'm bringing it back in and doing it a little bit different, so I hope you enjoy this. Now I have a new sweatshirt that I'm using, wonderful color, it's called Seafoam, but know that you can do this to any sweatshirt that you might have in your closet or one that you have found at the thrift store. This is just going to give it a new look to an existing sweatshirt. The first thing we're going to do is some deconstructing. I cut the band off right above the seam. There's a seam right above the band, and that is going to be my cut line. I'm going to just cut right above that. Next, I'm going to be cutting the seam off. I use this part as the drawstring that's going to be going around the bottom of the sweatshirt. I do save this piece. I make scarves. They look like patchwork scarves, and so I save these. Takes 4 bands to make one scarf, so I collect those. The next thing I'm going to cut off are the cuffs, and again I'm going to be cutting right above that seam line. I'll be cutting the seam off of the cuffs also, and we'll be just discarding these. Next, I'm opening up these cuffs and just trimming off this seam allowance here to open the cuff up flat. I'm going to be making the pocket out of these cuffs. I'm keeping one of the cuffs folded on the natural fold line, matching up the edges and placing a pin there. I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and just straight stitch this across, taking about 1/4 inch seam allowance. But I am going to stretch this to gather this in on top. My pocket now looks like this. And I've trimmed and rounded the corners on the bottom, and the top is nicely gathered. Now when I gathered this top, there was a little bit of an end part that I cut off already. I'm sorry the camera was turned off, but I cut this little end off, and that I am going to be using as a stabilizer for the buttonhole, excuse me, the buttonholes that the drawstring will be going through. So I'm going to save that little piece. The next thing I'm going to do is to find the center of the neck. I want to make a little slit on the neck just to give it a little bit more room going over your head. And it's more comfortable that way. So I'm just going to be matching the seams and putting a little mark. This is just a water soluble pen that I'm using, and just putting a little mark there. And then I'm going straight down and putting another little mark approximately 2 inches down from the first one. And I'm going to make a slit. You want to make sure you're not cutting through to the bottom. I'm going to zoom you in just a little bit here. So I'm just cutting the top layer and making a slit. Folding these back and just placing a pin here. Now on the bottom, bottom. I also want to find the center front on the bottom edge of this. So again, just matching up the side seams and finding the center and placing a pin. I'm going to be turning this up, and I'm going to be hemming it so that the inside is showing. I really like the insides of these shirts, and it just adds another texture to it. But first I want to stick my little stabilizer piece on. What I like to do with this is to pink it. I'm only going to be using one layer of it here, but pinking around the edges of this. A can of the spray and bond basting adhesive that I'm going to be spraying the back of this with. I'm doing this off camera, but I have an old box that I spray in right next to my table here. And then I'm placing this little piece over this pin. Taking the pin out, and with the same Mark Be Gone, I'm going to just draw a circle on both ends of this piece. I need to poke a hole through this, both of these two layers, right where I see those marks. And I use my Crocodile for this. This is the one by Memory Keeper. And I tell you, this works awesome for punching fabric. If you know, if you have this in your paper crafting supplies, it works really well for fabric also, and it will easily punch through two or three layers of fabric. This is quite bulky, so and it punches right through. Normally at this point you'll see the little pieces on the back side, and I'll just trim those off. You can see that it makes nice holes in this. Now if you have a buttonholer on your sewing machine and you're able to make nice neat little buttonholes on a knit like this, do that instead of this. I'm not one, I've just never had really good luck with it. I'm fine with my woven fabrics making buttonholes, but when it comes to these knits, it just doesn't seem to feed well. And so this is one of the methods that I have worked on, and it works really well for me. I'm going to be going to the sewing machine now, and I'm going to, with my free motion stitching, I'm going to be stitching around this rectangle, and then I go around and around and around on these little circles, which will reinforce the circles and really mimic like an eyelet type buttonhole. I'm at my sewing machine, and I have my free motion foot on. Sometimes it's called a darner foot. I have my feed dogs dropped, so I'm going to be doing the motion on this. And I have my stitch length set to 0. I'm lowering my pressure foot now, and I'm going to be going around this rectangle and then around those circles. I do a little back and forth motion right at the beginning of my stitching and at the end of my stitching for just a knot. I have my little piece all sewn. Now it's on to doing some more pinning. I turn this bottom band up approximately an inch, and I'm just going to give me a little bit of a guideline here. I'm not probably going to pin all the way around. Now this does make your sweatshirt shorter, but I love the look of a layered sweatshirt over the top of a lace bottom tank top, and that is how I display these in my little under my little canopy at a show. Also, I'm going to pin on the pocket. Most people are right-handed, and so I do put the pocket on the right-hand side, just above that bottom edge. I'll be going to my sewing machine again, and I'm going to be using one of my stitches that is an applique stitch that looks similar to a blanket stitch. And I will be stitching the top. I will be stitching around the pocket and also around the bottom and the cuff too. The cuffs are unfinished, so I'm going to be putting a blanket stitch around the edge of the cuff to finish that off. And I'll be back. I'm going to go take this to my sewing machine and do that edge stitching. I'm going to zoom in and show you what my stitching looks like. It's the neckline. The pocket. Now I will be adding a fabric embellishment to the top of this and also put a fun button on that. But the pocket, just edge stitched around that. And then the bottom also, that same blanket stitch. For the cuff, I just edge finished the bottom, very bottom of it. And the cuff will be worn now so that it's cuffed up. So it's going to look like this. Our sweatshirt is almost finished now, except for the embellishing on it. And I wanted to share with you the drawstring and a little bit on how I work with this. This is the seam that we cut off, and what I like to do with this is give it a stretch, and it tends to grow a little bit, and you're going to need that extra length to go around. And then I use my bodkin. Every sewing room needs one of these, so if you don't have one, keep this in mind. It's called a bodkin, wonderful for threading through elastics or drawstrings like this. And I'm going to just clamp it and push the little slider to make it real snug. And then I'm able to just weed my way through this little opening here. It's going to take a little bit of doing here, but it will go. And then you just keep going all the way around the bottom and then out through the other hole. Tie a knot on the bottom of each one of these, or on each end, just so it doesn't escape through the hole again. And there we go. Before we go on to the embellishing, I want to mention that you don't need to have a sewing machine with a fancy applique stitch to finish this sweatshirt. I have done it just using my straight stitch and using 2 narrow lines of straight stitch in place of the blanket or applique stitch, and it looks just wonderful. And especially on a sweatshirt fabric that is quite stable, it doesn't fray much at all, it doesn't ravel, and so that works just as well. Even on the cuffs, just doing 2 narrow lines of just straight stitching finishes it off and looks very professional. Aren't these just wonderful? I happened to find a collection of just 10 square or 10-inch square a pack at a garage sale, and they have I just love the colors. They kind of a boho look to them. Love the bright colors to them, and whether they even go with this sweatshirt or not, I find it doesn't really matter. I've done this many different colors, and I'm just using some of the same fabrics, and they all just turn out really wonderful. I'm also adding these just one of these buttons. But these are, aren't they fun? They're like they're a wooden button, but they are washable. And they're just multicolored. If I find the link, I'll put that down below for you. And I ordered them, and yeah, I think that they did come from China. I'm just letting you know, and it took a while, but I got them, and they work just really, really cute with this type of embellishment. I'm using my pinking shears. And I'm going to be cutting varying rectangles and squares for this design. I also found a whole roll of this vintage lace at the thrift store. Scored on that one. There was several spools, and I bought them all. So always look in that craft area on in your thrift stores, because you never know what you're going to come up with. But it has a beautiful vintage antique look to it. Really love it. And so I'm going to stick a piece of that in there. I'm going to be spraying the back of all my pieces again with my spray and bond basting adhesive. What I love about this is I can lay these on and I can reposition it. And then I can also just take it to my sewing machine, and it doesn't gum up my machine. I've never had a problem with it. It works really well. When I'm laying on my pieces, like I said, it is removable, so I can just take it off if I don't like what I've done. But I like jagged. I don't like them to line up. It's just something that I think is more pleasing if you just kind of have some interest to it. And I really like that. Going to lay on one of the buttons just to see what it's gonna. Yeah, something like that. I'm going to take this to my sewing machine with my free motion stitching again. And what I do when I do a collage like this, because this is going to be washed hopefully several times, hopefully whoever owns it will love it and just continue to wear it, but I go around each of my squares several times on the edges. I also do different meander stitches throughout it. Maybe one square I'll do a X, maybe the other square I'll just meander throughout the whole thing. Maybe another one I'll do a spiral. Another thing I like to do is to go completely off of the fabric or off of the collage and onto the sweatshirt. Do different things like that. I will set my camera up again at the sewing machine, and you can watch me do my free motion. And then it's almost done, just attaching the button. One of the things that I do also like to do is add, and I might do this one too, and that is add some paint through a stencil. Just to add another layer, another texture, and just some more interest to it. So I'm going to be doing that also, and I'm going to set up at my sewing machine. My fabric collage is all sewn on. I'm going to add a little bit of stenciling to this. I've decided on this stencil by, it's by Plaid. I picked this up at Tuesday morning, so I don't know if it's still available or not, but any kind of all over stencil design would be work just great for this. And I'm just going to add little pieces of this stencil. I've decided to use this is a Delta acrylic paint. This is just a craft paint, but the color is called the Corn Silk Yellow. And I thought it would mimic the lace a little just by putting a little corner here, and we'll see how that all works. But to do this, I use equal parts of the acrylic paint to the fabric medium, and I'm using the golden GAC 900 fabric medium. This will have to be heat set, so I will be ironing all this after the paint dries. I'm doing this off camera here. I have a plate. I put the medium on there, and then I'm going to put the paint in there too and mix it together. This takes very little paint. When you do stenciling on fabric, honestly, a little goes a long way. You don't want much on your brush, and you just tap it. I want to go over the top of this pocket a bit, and just right in this corner area I want to add a little bit of this stencil. I finished up with the stenciling. It's very faint, but you can see it both on the pocket and on the fabric and on the sweatshirt. I'm going to wait for this to dry, and I'll go ahead and heat set that paint, and then of course add my little button. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it gives you an idea of what you can do with a sweatshirt that you might have on hand. Happy creating!